Draw.
The sun above WindCut Pass wasn't a sky thing anymore. It had turned into a weight a man could feel in his bones, a hammer, head of light beating the ridge until the red earth gave off breath like a forge. Heat crawled into the seams of everything, the saddle stitching, the grain of the fence rails, the tiny cracks at the corners of a mouth that had forgotten what water tasted like. Lila Caraway had stopped counting miles some time back when numbers turned mean and unhelpful. First, she had counted steps. Then she counted her own heartbeats like coins she might run out of. Then she counted nothing, because nothing was easier to carry than fear. Her bonnet had torn loose in the ambush, leaving a raw circle of skin burning at the nape of her neck. Her travel dress had collected half the trail between Last Chance Crossing and the place where Beckett's men stopped the stage dust ground in, a smear of wagon grease at the hem, a thread pull that snagged like a memory. She had kept one glove, lost the other, and so her left hand burned while her right hand sweated, which seemed a kind of joke the desert was telling at her expense. She did not pray, not the way her mother taught hands folded, voice careful as crystal. She bargained, one swallow, one shade, one chance at a door with a roof behind it. She tried to say, please, but the word cracked on her lips and died there. Somewhere in the back of her skull, a noise kept living. A stage driver's cry breaking off wrong, a horse screaming, laughter with gravel in it, the sound a ring makes when it leaves a finger too fast. She put it all away. She had learned since Philadelphia that certain sounds, like certain shames, were best handled later or not at all. The ground tilted, the sky brightened until it hurt. On the ridgeline to her left, a figure cut itself out of the glare, a rider motionless as a signpost, horse dark against light, both of them quiet as judgment. She took one more step and forgot the rest. Elias Hart didn't think of himself as a rescuer. Men who made a habit of saving folks often had a habit of making a mess first. He believed in simpler verbs: mend, haul, check, wait. He had been riding the north fence again, the same quarter-mile twice over, because sag gives you no warning, and cattle will find a hole a bee would think twice about when he saw the human shape collapse as neatly as a tent letting go its ropes. The land played tricks on you, especially in noonlight. A stump that wasn't, mirage that made water from heat. This wasn't one. This was a woman. She had no business being alone out there with the pass throwing back fire. He put Night into a careful walk, the bay gelding's ears forward, the reins threaded through fingers that still bore the small white dents of old rope burns. Up close he saw a face younger than the desert had argued something delicate at the cheekbone that said city and education and a lifetime of being watched over by walls. Her pulse was there, small and stubborn. Her breath came short as a knife. Heat had blown her pupils wide, and there was a thin scar hiding at her hairline. Old business, not this days. He didn't ask her name. Names were for after. He lifted an easy movement learned from years of moving calves and men who'd drunk their courage all wrong. She was light as an empty promise. Easy, he said into her hair, though folks in this condition didn't hear and didn't need to. He set her sideways in the saddle, swung up behind, and made of his arms a gate that kept the world from jostling what little she had left. Night listened to the mood through the leather and went soft-footed, hooves picking the trail like a seamstress takes stitches small, even, patient. The trail home remembered them. It kept the powder of other hot days in its ruts, made a sound like a silk dress when wind laid a hand over the sage. Ravens watched from a scatter of dead trees, black punctuation in a sentence the land was writing without help. Elias let his weight move with Night's shoulders, a steadying that told the gelding there was nothing to fear except the ordinary, which was plenty. Three-Spur Ranch lay west under a run of cottonwoods. The house slanted long to catch the evening breeze, the pump handle shiny where hands had asked favors of it 1,000 times. Most days it was smaller than the word ranch deserved. Today it looked like sense. Etta Mae had the front door open before boot met stirrup. "Lord preserve," she said, not shirking a prayer and not shy of a scold. She set the blue enamel basin on the kitchen table like a doctor banging down a case and went to work on water, cloths, vinegar, all the quiet cure that living long had taught her. Elias cut through laces turned mud by sweat, slid the canteen against a mouth that had forgotten how to say yes, Small sips, he said, letting each trickle count like wages paid slow. The throat worked. The cheeks let color think about returning. When sleep took her again, it took her easy. Etta traded the dust-bitten dress for a spare nightgown, shook baking soda into her bathwater like a woman bribing heat to leave. "She'll do," Etta judged after a while, pressing the back of her hand to that hot brow. "If the desert hasn't salted her past saving." Elias stood a moment too long in the doorframe, a man where he didn't know if he was useful. "Fetch more," Etta said without looking. He fetched. He fetched until fetching felt like an answer to a question no one had asked. Between trips he sat the way soldiers sit when they've stopped moving but haven't stopped being at war. He watched the sleep shape of her face. He saw old bruises at the upper arms, finger marks pressed like signatures by men who did not deserve to write anything on anybody. Something stood up inside him, then no trumpet, no oath, just a wall that said, "Not here." The day leaned toward mercy at last. The heat, letting go enough for the porch to remember how to be a porch. Flies lowered their ambition. The tall clock Etta pretended she didn't care about remembered to tick. Elias set the spare chair beside the bed. He had tried reading and let the book slide shut on itself. Words about other lives always felt too loud when a present one hung in the balance. He changed the cloth on her forehead every 10 minutes until 10 minutes stopped being a measure and became a habit that didn't need clocks. When he stepped out to the pump, the yard wore its work like good clothes. Harness cleaned yesterday, a stack of cut posts by the corral waiting for holes, the smell of horses that had decided to nap instead of argue. He pulled the handle until the water ran cold and easy, filled the basin, and stood a moment letting wet hands cool his pulse. The wind got curious with the cottonwoods, and the cottonwoods answered in their language of coins and secrets. It was dark when she opened her eyes again, lamp turned low. The room, a cave with one small Sunday panic, lives close to the surface in folks who wake in new rooms. He saw it come to her like a wave and lift and nearly break. He raised an open hand, no nearer. "You're safe," he said, and meant only the kind a man is allowed to mean. "No one here will hurt you. You're at Three-Spur Ranch. I'm Elias Hart." Her lips tried the shape of words, found just enough. "Lila, Caraway." The name rang like a spoon on a glass clear, a touch formal, not built for dust. He let the syllables settle in the room. "WindCut," she said next, throat scraping. He shook his head once. "Not tonight." She tried sitting and learned what the desert thought of that. He propped pillows, slid a palm behind her shoulder blades so she wouldn't dip back and tear what strength she'd stacked. The tin cup came to her mouth, and he tipped it moment, swallow, breath, a rhythm you could set a life to. When Etta appeared in the doorway, she gave an appraisal that was part mercy, part math. "Brains enough to listen," she said. "She'll live." "Any riders see you?" Etta asked Elias, eye still on the girl as if sight alone could keep fever confused. "No dust," he said. "Just sun and her." "You fetch the sheriff," Etta decided, "when she's not liable to forget her name again." Tomorrow," Elias said. "We keep watch tonight." Etta's mouth shaped approval and censure at once. "Then sit where sitting saves. I'll rock the house, you rock the hours." Toward midnight, the house made its small music timber settling, cricket near the threshold, the far breath of cattle. Elias slept in the hard chair because beds were for folks who needed them worse. A cavalryman learns what a doze is and how to make use of it. He did the thing men do when they have seen too much and remembered it all. Positioned himself so his first look would be of the door, his second of the patient. He set his hat on the post of the bed the way you hang a promise where you can see it. Lila drifted. Fever makes a bad poet of the mind images with their edges off, voices you owe answers to. She saw Philadelphia's winter with its neat handkerchiefs of snow and heard the bell of St. Bartholomew's mark time like a mother. She saw the stage again, not the bang and flare of it, but the moment right before the driver shifting, the horse's ears sharpening in the same direction, the quiet that always comes before men call it noise. She saw her own hands, tidy on her lap, and then not tidy, and then empty. When she found her way back to the room, the lamp's small sun was still there. So was steady breath not hers. Dawn peeled the dark back slow, like someone careful with paper. Lila woke into a world made of ordinary, window pale, the faint smudge of cottonwoods out there, the sour of vinegar in the basin, 2 sets of boots stacked by the door in a way that made sense. She tested her throat and was surprised to find a voice there. "Do you," she asked, "collect strays as a hobby?" His mouth thought about a smile. "Fence posts and strays," he said. "The territory breaks both. I mend what I can." "The territory," she said, tasting the syllables like medicine. "Does it break on purpose?" "It doesn't have to," he said. "It's big enough not to bother." He brought the cup again. She took a careful swallow, then another. Water polightened the morning. Ask muscles to please remember their names. Etta appeared with a bowl of broth and the expression of a judge who prefers mercy but will employ law. "Sip," she ordered, "and do not argue. If you faint again, make it somewhere with a rug. Wood bruises. Lo." At noon, Sheriff Tom Avery rode up like dust that had learned to sit a saddle. He listened to Elias's spare account, no heroics, no adjectives, then nodded once, as a man does when a thing he disliked came true. "Beckett," he said, "smells like him. 5 men, one meaner than the rest, all proud of being poor at choosing." He angled his chin toward the house. "If she saw their faces, she's a page in my book and a target in his. You want a deputy on the lane?" Elias's jaw made a decision before his words did. "I'll keep her here." Tom's mustache did a small, tired dance. "I'll put 2 riders cutting the east draw. Keep your lamp trimmed, Elias. Beckett bites when you think he's run out of teeth." "Does he think of himself as a gentleman?" Lila asked from the bed, voice steadier for having defied quiet. Tom tipped his hat to her gravity. "Ma'am, he thinks of himself as an exception. Men who do are always dangerous." I'll testify," she said, and surprised herself with how the promise steadied the room. "We'll get you to a judge when we can afford to make noise," Tom said. "For now, make only the kind that feeds you." He left a card with his name and a scrawl that pretended to be his address and rode off, dust behaving as if it had learned manners. After Tom left, the sun stood over the yard like a foreman. Elias checked hinges, oil, the leaning corner of the corral. He mended a step that had been making itself known for 6 months. Etta pulled curtains half across, as if the house were shy and had a right to be. She moved through rooms with the authority of a woman who had made a treaty with time. Polish here, pinch a wick there, set a chair so stories would choose it. In the quiet that followed, Lila slept the good kind, the kind that builds rather than steals. He sat again, and when he saw her fingers twitch, he didn't take them, didn't crowd the miracle. He just stayed where a person is when staying is what saves. By late afternoon, she wanted the window and whatever honesty lay beyond it. He opened it for her. The cottonwoods gave a long answer, leaves whispering in a language anyone with a heart could learn. "It is beautiful," she said, "in a way that hurts." "Most honest things are," he answered. Then wished he'd said less. She tracked the line of the fence running west like a hymn written in wire. "Is that all you do?" she asked. "Mend?" "All is plenty," he said. "I read some, when nights demand it. I ride the line. I try to make wrong things hold until they can be made right." He did not ask if there was someone expecting her. She carried that question herself without dropping it, but when she looked at the table blank paper, a stub of pencil, he put them near her elbow without talk, as a man might leave a glass of water within reach and look away while thirst decided. She wrote a line and covered it with her hand. She crossed it out and wrote shorter. The operator in town would make the words shorter yet, charge by the root and branch. Robbery, live, at Three-Spur. Awaiting instruction. She stared at awaiting as if it were a thorn that might be a splinter. When she folded the paper, the look on her face said hope and dread are cousins that share a room and don't get on. "Tomorrow," Elias said when she glanced up, "we'll ride the easy way. Shade where there's shade." "Do people look," she asked, "at women who arrive carried?" "Some do," he said. "Most pretend they don't, if they were raised correct." "Were you?" "Working at it," he said, and Etta snorted softly from the kitchen, which was an older amen. Evening returned the world to its right size, the kitchen filled with a smell that lied kindly about how much meat had gone into the stew. Etta took one look at Lila's bowl, put 2 more ladles in it, and frowned until Lila obeyed. Teaching or living, either way, you need weight, she said. Men will tell you bravery is muscle. It's not. It's calories and a good night's sleep. I used to think bravery was not asking for water, Lila said. That's pride, Etta said. Pride's a poor ranch hand. The lamp burned low while the 3 of them performed the graceful clatter of a house alive. Dish to shelf, pot to hook, chair to corner. Lila's eyes kept finding the doorway, which had begun to mean something like refuge. Elias felt the floorboards under his boots and knew every squeak by name, a knowledge that had been useless yesterday and felt like a vow tonight. He carried kindling as if it were ceremony, set the poker where it wanted to live, and let the lamp draw a circle around their evening that trouble would have to think twice about crossing. Later, when Etta declared the kitchen off duty and the night on watch, Lila asked quietly, "Do you believe in luck?" "I believe in work that looks like luck from far away," Elias said. "And in neighbors. Neighbors can be trained to look like miracles." Philadelphia didn't have those, she said, surprised at the bitterness in her mouth. "It had bells," he offered. "Bells tell you what hour you missed," she said. "Neighbors tell you where supper is." When sleep finally took the room, it left the porch for him. He sat with the coffee that had lost the fight against bitterness hours ago and watched star pricks come out where smoke from the day's heat met air that had decided to be kind. The horizon did its slow trick of erasing itself. Coyotes found their jokes again. He was not thinking future. A man in his line of living had learned not to lay track too far. He was thinking wake-up times, supplies, a dress that fit, a hat that shaded, boots that didn't blister, a telegram handed over a counter without questions that bit. He could not return her past. He could, if he was worth his salt, build a fence strong enough that when the past came nosing around, it would take its trouble another way. His mind wandered the way minds do when the body is still, to the far pasture where the spring had gone thin and then fat again, to Alina's picture in its peppermint tin, and the way grief had learned finally to go sit in the corner when asked, to Tom Avery's mustache weather vane, for the county's moods, to the notion that a woman's name said properly can mend a man's posture. He said "Lila" once into his cup, just to check the fit of it against his teeth, and then felt like a thief and set the cup down hard. Etta's step sounded behind him. "You're wearing a hole in that chair," she said, settling into the other rocker with a shawl that had survived more stories than either of them had a right to. "Chairs are tougher than men," he said. "Chairs don't make promises," she said. "They only keep weight." "I didn't promise anything." You brought her in your arms," Etta said. "That's promise enough for the first day." They rocked a while without agreeing to. The night did its mathematics. Somewhere across the draw, a whippoorwill announced the inventory of his heart. Etta said, "She'll stay or she won't. Either way, you be the kind of fence a person leans on without splinters." He nodded, chin to chest, the kind of bowmen give to truth, and when, toward dawn, she turned on the pillow and reached for water, for a fact, for a human being who'd not yet failed her, his hand was there without ceremony, not grasping, not claiming. A post, a gate, a thing that holds. The first light crept in thin as sewing thread, gold tugging at the edges of the curtains Etta had drawn. The house inhaled, and the 3 of them, one sleeping, one rocking, one remembering a war he wouldn't tell children about, became a small republic of consent. Somewhere a distant rider found a better road than mischief. Somewhere a judge woke without knowing the day would require his plainest ink. And the cottonwoods, noticing nothing and everything, signed their names across the sky with leaves that whispered the same word over and over. The one houses mean when they bother to stand. Stay. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. By the second morning, Lila could sit without the world giving way under her. By the third, she walked as far as the porch, which gave her the peculiar satisfaction of a traveler stepping into a church and discovering that silence can be generous. The cottonwoods kept a conversation going above the yard, and the pump gave water with a sound like old promises kept. Etta put Lila's hair up in a quick, practical twist, her fingers exact without being fussy. "You got anyone to notify?" she asked, pinning the last strand. Lila considered the word anyone. She had thought she did. "Perhaps," she said. Etta's eyes said she'd met perhaps, and did not hold it against people. "Town," Elias said after breakfast, the word falling careful in the space between them. He had saddled Daisy gentle as a deacon, sure of foot, and adjusted the stirrups shorter without comment. He explained the road like a man who'd learned that giving a person small things to think about can keep large terrors from climbing the fence. "We'll keep to the river lane," he said. "Less Sunday, and Night minds a lady's pace." Lila smiled at that. Night flicked an ear as if he'd been complimented. They rode into Last Chance Crossing, with the day still deciding whether it wanted to be kind. The town was a straight line of ambitions. A blacksmith with a roof newer than the walls beneath it. A general store where flour, nails, gossip, and ribbon shared a counter. A saloon that pretended not to be a church of another kind. A hotel whose porch had seen more boots than beds. A schoolhouse set a little apart in dignity and paint. 2 dogs argued without conviction under a wagon. A woman swept her threshold with more vigor than the dust had earned. The telegraph office was a narrow room with a window that remembered being clean. The operator had spectacles perched on the peak of a nose, made for doubting. He handed Lila a form and a pencil, then took up his magazine and set his eyes on the same paragraph 3 times, while pretending not to watch. Elias faced the street and gave her his back like a curtain. She wrote 6 words and didn't like them. Wrote 9 and liked them less. Crossed out everything and started small. Robbery. Alive. Awaiting instruction. She added her name, then thought better, and wrote El Caraway, because distance required caution. The operator tallied the cost and quoted it as if bargaining were a sin. Elias paid, not looking at her while he did it. "What did you say?" he asked when they stepped back into the brightness. "Not much," she said, which was honest and useless both. He nodded. "Not much has a way of being plenty," he answered, and turned them toward Doc Keller's so she could see the Harpers if they were up to being seen. The doctor's house smelled of camphor and boiled linen. Mrs. Harper met them with a sigh that had laughter at the edges. She took Lila's hands and delivered a blessing in a language she'd made up out of gratitude and habit. "I told the Lord I would accept whatever he sent," she said, "but I also told him it better not be more of that gang." Mr. Harper slept in a chair with his mouth slightly open, his hand still in his wife's even in dreams. Lila touched the old woman's shoulder and felt something like a root taking hold. They didn't stay long. Grief and relief both tire a body. On the way to the general store, Elias was quiet in the way men are when they're taking measurement. Of a town, a problem, a future, they have no right to imagine yet. He bought 3 dresses suitable to a plain life and a ribbon, the color of creek water in shade. When she protested, he said nothing, and then, "You'll pay me back by making children read," which closed the subject. At the bookstore, a small miracle. A few shelves kept carefully by a man with ink on his cuff. Lila found nothing she needed and everything she wanted. She touched spines like she was greeting cousins. "Emerson," she said, and the bookseller lit up as if someone had remembered his birthday. Elias paid for the thin volume without comment. In the saloon's shadow, 2 men watched one with curiosity, one with that vacant appetite trouble wears. Tom Avery appeared with deputy and mustache, and the appetite looked away. "News?" Elias asked. Tom scratched his jaw. "2 of Beckett's peeled off south," he said. "One went east, thinking maybe the territory was polite. It ain't." His eyes went to Lila, and then down, gentleman enough to study the boardwalk. "You need anything you can't say aloud, send word to Hannah," he told her. "She runs the ladies' circle at the church," which is to say she runs the county. Lila smiled in a way that promised to remember the name. The ride home moved slower, not for fatigue but because pace is what civilization is made from. Elias talked in short pieces about the river Cottonwoods, the bend where beaver chewed down a tree and gave up halfway, the place where cattle liked to test his patience, and his fence. She answered with small truths: Philadelphia winters, ink-stained fingers, girls who did sums faster when you called them by their second names. He said nothing about future. He said a lot about mending again. She let him. The telegram came the same evening. A boy riding splay-legged, with importance and dust. Lila opened it with hands steady in spite of everything. Regret to inform. Circumstances changed. Married Catherine Wilson last month. Wish you well, Jay. She read it twice. She was braced for the pain. She wasn't ready for the release. Relief is its own shame if you've been taught properly. He's married, she told Elias. Her voice did not break. To someone else. He reached for words and let most of them go unsaid. Then your road is yours again, he managed at last. Her eyes filled and did not spill. I feel wicked for being grateful, she whispered. You feel correct, he said gently. There's no virtue in using up your life to honor a lie, someone told himself. She folded the paper, put it in the book she'd bought, then seemed to stand straighter by a notch you'd only notice if you watched people for a living. After supper, they took coffee to the porch and let the evening do its mending. The sky put fire behind the cottonwoods, and then the dark came down without hurry. Lila told him about the headmistress who had believed the wrong son, about letters that made promises a body could not keep, about the business of leaving a city that defines you by address and arriving somewhere that asks you to define yourself by work. Elias offered his own ration of truth, the war that wouldn't be over the way the papers said. A sister he couldn't save from a fever that didn't care about good men. The day he realized loneliness could live even in a room full of neighbors if the room lacked one particular voice. What do you want? He asked at last, the question sudden and too large, and she didn't flinch. To teach, she said. To put names to things so they aren't so frightening. To make a life where my waking doesn't depend on what another person decides about me in a letter. He nodded. There's a schoolhouse, he said, as if she'd never noticed. The corner of her mouth thought about joy. So there is, she said. Do they pay? Not in flour, he said. Mostly in coin. Miraculous, she said dryly. The school board met in the bank because the bank had chairs that matched. Charles Montgomery, who had money enough to treat honest conversation like a hobby, asked questions that were decent in spite of himself. Lila answered without apology. She had the look of a person who had remembered her use. Montgomery offered wages you could live on if you liked beans and weren't fussy. She took it as if taking work were a sacrament. On the way out, Tom stopped them. Beckett'll hear you said yes to a public life, he warned. Not rough, not gentle. Men like him assume the world is a stage built to flatter them. You standing up front with chalk in your hand will read to him like invitation. Elias looked past the sheriff to the street, where a dog slept in shade that was not quite big enough. He's invited nowhere, he said. Tom nodded. You're not wrong. Still, keep the lantern full and the doors locked. He tipped his hat in a movement that had better manners than most sermons. At dusk, when chores quiet themselves and a house leans on its foundations, Elias set a small, brass-capped box on the table and opened it. Inside lay a colt whose bluing had gone soft, the walnut smooth from a decade of being asked to say last words. He hated needing it in the same room as a woman who used pencils for a living. I don't like this, he said, but I like less the thought of you without a thing that evens odds. Lila looked down at the revolver the way one looks at a piano key that plays only laments. Teach me, she said. He had expected refusal. He had not expected courage this quiet. They walked to the back pasture in morning's pale light. He showed her the stance, knees soft, shoulders easy, elbows not locked. Respect, he repeated, not worship. Her first shot made her eyes close just before the trigger broke. Eyes open, he said, and put a hand over hers just long enough to steady the next try. By the fifth cartridge, she struck tin enough to make Etta come to the porch and clap exactly once. You'll do, Etta pronounced, and took the wash down from the line. The days braided themselves into a patterned town for lists and slates and chalk, ranch for mending and meals and the long quiet that follows not dying. Lila practiced names for the role. 12 boys, 11 girls, 2 who would come when the river dropped, 1 who would not because his father planned to keep him useful a little longer. She wrote numbers that promised a world orderly enough to trust, then opened the door for the truth that a world is never that tidy. Elias rode the fence and found himself thinking west less and house more. He cut new posts as if planting them deep might keep certain kinds of trouble from thinking well of itself. Trouble thought well of itself anyway. Choice rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It clears its throat in the dark, lights a far shed, waits to see if men will run the wrong direction. Just before dawn, a curl of smoke unrolled itself from the hay. The alarm went hand to hand. Spoon on skillet, shout pitched low to carry without panicking the horses. Tom's voice cut through the yard with the comfort of curses well placed. "Hold the line," he said. "Let the blaze burn where it wants, and not where it shouldn't." Men formed a bucket string, until their arms forgot how not to burn. They saved more than they lost. Dawn came on bruised and useful. In the ash near the far door, someone had scrawled a shape with a boot heel, a bee, that looked too proud of its own flourish. Tom squatted and scuffed it gentler than it deserved. "He's writing his name where he means to be the author," the sheriff said. "I'm of a mind to edit." They posted watch, doubled it at night. Etta kept the shotgun where knitting had been and folded dish towels with more firmness than dish towels require. Lila slept in her dress, pistol in the bedside drawer, steady as a rule. Elias walked the house in the last light, listening for timbers speaking wrong. He checked the hinges again because checking is sometimes the only thing a man can do that changes anything. Out at the far edge of the property, the river said, "Keep moving." The cottonwoods agreed with their hands. The land waited. There are nights when a place seems to pick a side. This one had. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second and tell us where you're watching from if you love stories of the last West town. The morning came on with a thin film of clouds, torn and translucent, the kind of sky that looks like a mercy note tucked under a door. It had rained somewhere too far to help them, just enough for the air to carry the clean, metallic whisper of wet stone without offering a single drop. Elias carried the old Colt in its brass-capped box to the back pasture. He set the cans on the split rail at distances his hands could measure in sleep, 5 paces, 8, 12, then a foolish one at 20, just to keep ambition honest. Night grazed along the fence line, flicking his tail at flies in a rhythm that sounded like patience. "We'll start close," Elias said, "so the day can meet you halfway." Lila nodded, the braid Etta had made settling against the back of her neck like the line a horizon draws when it wants to be kind. Dust sat tender on her cheekbones. Fever's pink had faded to the faint, stubborn color of someone who had negotiated with heat and won by a breath. She lifted the pistol with 2 hands, elbows not sure if they belonged to a body or to a prayer. He showed her the stance, knees soft, shoulders not locked, elbows remembering what grace feels like. "Respect," he said, "not worship." He tapped her left foot half a shoe length forward, nudged her chin down with a crooked finger, then stepped back the way a man steps off a porch when the weather turns no flourish, just a choice. The first shot bucked out of her like a horse afraid of its own shadow. The recoil startled a soft gasp from her throat, and she blinked, cheeks flushing, as if the noise had been personal. The second found wood with a tidy knock that made Knight lift his head and decide, after consideration, not to care. The third kissed the can, and made a sound so small and triumphant that Lila laughed, a breathless, startled thing that didn't belong to the desert, and yet did. It put a color in the air that wanted to stay. "Again," she said, and the word came out like a prayer that had finally figured out what to ask for. Elias reloaded with that soldier's economy that wastes nothing, not motion, not words, not the thin thread of confidence just beginning to wind around the moment. He watched her discover that breath is a tool, that the sight will line up if the hand remembers it is an instrument, not a verdict. The can danced twice more. The rail recorded a sermon in lead that no preacher could have delivered gentler. Between cartridges, she talked Philadelphia winters with their particular blue at the edges of afternoon, coal smoke and piano lessons in second-story windows, chalk dust on sleeves, and the way girls sit up straighter when you call them by their second names. She gave him a street name, Walnut, and the feel of its cobbles under boots the day she left, told him how snow there made a hush that even carriages respected, and how the West made a different hush that carried a warning you learned or else. She told him about the advertisement that had seemed like a bridge over a river. Respectable gentleman seeks wife of good character, and how letters can polish a man until he shines in places that shouldn't. How politeness can be its own mask. How the East breeds a particular kind of hunger that wears a good coat and calls itself security. About the slow heat of hope, and then the crisp, cold shape of shame when you realize you have wanted something that was wrong for you, and wanted it sincerely. Worst part, she said, citing the Farcan, is that it wasn't even love, just relief in fancy clothes. The report cracked. The Farcan toppled as if grateful to be done with speculation. Elias did what men who have learned better do. He didn't turn her sorrow into theater or his comfort into a sermon. He listened with all the steadiness he used to keep a skittish horse from bolting, then refilled the colt and let his palm cover hers for exactly as long as it took her breath to settle. The next shot rang truer. The one after that made Etta clap once from the porch and declare, "You'll do," before taking the wash off the line with a little more pride than laundry usually earns. The practice turned to ritual. 5 shots. Breathe, correct. 5 more. Smile like you don't dare. Then 2 at the foolish 20. Pace can so it would stop bragging. When the brass lay in a small golden scatter at their feet and the sun had wrestled the last of the clouds away, Elias lowered the hammer on an empty chamber and said, "Enough. You don't have to prove anything to the day." Lila looked at the cans, their fallen, dull tin expressions, and let victory be a private thing. They walked back the long way, past the cottonwoods that held their own council above the irrigation ditch, past Etta's kitchen garden where beans climbed string like clever children. Etta met them at the pump and pulled water as if daring thirst to try its old tricks. "Drink," she ordered, pressing the tin cup into Lila's hand first, then Elias's. "And eat before you go turning holiness into lightheadedness. I made Johnny cakes because I like the name, not the taste." Lo. By midday the telegraph wire began its thin, insect whine, the sound the territory makes when news is moving faster than hooves. If you lived here long enough, you could tell the difference between wind playing the wire for mischief and a message working its way along like a river tightened into metal. Tom Avery rode through the cottonwoods, with dust like a cloak and a sentence already forming. He dismounted in the yard with that quiet he wore when he meant to take trouble by the neck. "Beckett lost patience," he said. "Or found it. Either way, he's marking tissue paper with his boot heel, like a man who wants his name to outlive him. He had a square of paper folded twice, and he tapped it once against his palm as if to feel whether words had weight. Stage out by Coyote Bend. 3 riders asked it questions with guns and didn't leave enough courtesy to cover the answers. That." He let his gaze take in the lamplight on the table through the open door, the orderly stack of ledgers, the cup Lila had set to dry with a neatness that declared a schoolroom in her bones. The sight of order in a place where chaos liked to rent rooms seemed to lift him half an inch out of his own dust. "I'll ride the far draw," Tom said. "You keep your doors honest." He tipped his hat to Lila as if a teacher's presence had already improved the grammar of the county. "Ma'am, if you need a thing and can't send a man for it, send a note with Hannah. She runs the stitch circle and the rest of us besides." "That true," Etta called from the kitchen. "Tom Avery only sheriff on paper. Hannah runs his soul." Tom touched his brim in surrender, then swung up and trotted out, the horse's shadow folding in and out of cottonwood shade like a second thought. That evening, with the day's heat folded away and the cottonwoods talking low, Lila asked to see the ledgers. Numbers are their own kind of weather. They move in fronts, they clear, they lie down, they march back. She set the columns straight, corrected a transposed figure with a small frown that made Elias want to thank an arithmetic book somewhere. She sharpened his pencil with a penknife and laid the shavings in a tidy curl on a saucer, then pulled his receipts into obedient stacks. "You underprice your winter feed by a penny a pound," she said, and smiled to soften the scold. "A penny's the distance between a good season and a hard one." He took the note like he took rain, grateful and pretending not to be. "We charge the Henderson boys a penny less because they're always a penny short," he said. "If I raise it, they'll still be short." "Then raise it for men who aren't short," she answered. "Let fairness be clever." He lifted one eyebrow in that spare, Western way that can mean approval, surprise, or the intention to repair a fence at first light. "Fairness being clever," he said. "I'll try that hat on." They ate cold beef with mustard and too many pickles, because Etta had a way of falling in love with a barrel and then making everyone pay for it with puckered lips. After, when the lamp had smoked a soft crescent on the chimney glass, Elias set a dented peppermint tin on the table, opened it, and slid a photograph out by its careful edges. The girl in the picture looked back with the absolute conviction of 18, a face that had never yet bargained with weather or grief, and believed, politely, that she wouldn't have to. "My sister," he said. "Alina." The name came quiet, as if the house might break it. "Fever took her the first winter here. I kept thinking if I rode far enough, I could find the part of the wind that did it and return the favor." He gave a quick, embarrassed smile for the foolishness of men who think distance can be negotiated with grief. "I was mean to the wind for a while afterwards, like it would answer to me." Lila didn't say "I'm sorry," because apology to a winter helps no one. She laid 2 fingers by the photograph as if to indicate presence, not remedy. "My mother kept one picture," she said. "It was of a table set on a Sunday with all the silver we couldn't afford to polish unless company came. She called it proof we were the kind of people who could have company." She smiled a small, sideways smile. "When I left, I took the picture. It didn't help with thirst." Elias put the photograph away the way a man covers a sleeping child, careful with corner and fold. The peppermint smell climbed the air, startling and sweet, like memory pretending to be useful. They were nearer after that, and nothing had been promised. Nearness is its own fact, like weather or gravity. You can argue with it and still be wet, still fall. It moved around the house like a fourth occupant, laid a hand on the back of a chair where Lila sat, made Etta hum in the kitchen with a sly, contented note, shadowed Elias on the porch when the night got its dark properly in order. Days braided themselves. Mornings in the back pasture with the colt, and a line of cans that learned to fear her patience. A new trick where Elias tossed a pine cone, and she snapped a shot quick enough to ring the rail beside it, then laugh at missing as if that were the point. Afternoons in town where the board at the bank agreed that a person who could do division without counting on fingers was a civic necessity. The banker's pen scratching out an agreement that made sense even after supper. There was the hour they stood in the schoolhouse, empty yet smelling of sap and possibility, while Lila measured desks with a piece of twine and made small marks in the margin of a catalog. 15 slates, 6 readers, 2 boxes of chalk, a bell rope repaired. She chalked the word "welcome" on the board and immediately erased it, embarrassed by its optimism. "You can write it again," Elias said. "It's true, even if you had to practice." Mend. Evenings where the house produced a music of small duties performed well dish to shelf, lamp trimmed, the porch swept of a day's grit. Etta trained Lila to the kitchen's laws. Salt last, water first, and the coffee spoon is an instrument, not a shovel. Elias mended a hinge that had been insulting him for a month, and then washed his hands on the back step, looking sheepish when Lila caught him scrubbing with soap, as if that were extravagance. In the schoolhouse, Lila set names in chalk and practiced saying them aloud until each sounded like an invitation. Ruthie, Jonah, August, Mary, Lou, Teddy, Juan, little Ada, whose mother had sent word she would come only if Ada could bring the baby she watched. Ike, who came barefoot and left his hat on because it felt like courage. 2 brothers so close in age, no one believed the mother's arithmetic. She drew the shape of the world on the board in white arcs, and told the room in her mind that maps were not promises, but they helped you keep your footing. Once, on the board's corner, she wrote the words "a person can begin again" and put a dot under each one, then wiped them away before anybody could testify to her need. Elias came by later with a basket of apples he swore he had always meant for the teacher and not for any other purpose. He set them on the desk and looked baffled and pleased at the same time, as men do when their hands have gotten ahead of their cautions. The trouble announced itself not with a mouthful of thunder but with the quiet, purposeful glow of a far shed at an hour when wood does not choose to burn. The first person who saw it didn't shout. He struck a skillet with a spoon, which is the frontier's bell. Sound travels different when it belongs to duty. Men ran, but not stupid. They made a line like a sentence that knew where to end. Buckets traveled from pump to flame, from flame to mud, until arms forgot language and remembered only lift and pass, lift and pass. Elias worked with a steadiness that did not belong to panic, his face gone that calm, that means calculation, not indifference. Tom's voice cutting clean around corners, sending 2 men to the west wall, where Sparks thought about ambition. Etta at the kitchen door with the shotgun broken over her arm like a knitting project, eyes small and bright, shooing children and dogs and one rooster that had misinterpreted everything. Lila hauled buckets until her shoulders sang, then operated the pump when her hands shook too hard for fire. They saved half the hay and all the house, which is an excellent ratio when you live where nothing promises to stay. Smoke made lace out of the cottonwoods. Dawn climbed up the spine of the world in a color that didn't have a name because it belonged to hours most people would be sleeping through if they could afford sleep. In the ash, someone had dragged a line with a heel, a B, that wanted to be read as signature and threat. Tom looked at it and shook his head like a teacher disappointed in a boastful boy. "He's writing his name where the law will have to see it," he said. "I don't mind men making my job easier." Elias crouched, ran a finger once through the mark, and wiped the ash off on his trouser leg with a quiet that did not forecast mercy. Lila watched the small motion and felt the world shift an inch, not toward fear, but toward the exact weight of their situation. Beckett was not superstition. He was a man. Men can be stopped. Men can get lucky. Both truths can keep a person sober. That night, watch changed hands without anyone announcing it, Elias to Jake to Harmon to the young deputy, who couldn't stop apologizing to the dark, as if the night had been inconvenienced. Lila slept in her dress with the Colt in the bedside drawer, not because she wanted it there, but because wanting is sometimes the wrong measure. She lay on her side with her hand under her cheek the way she had as a child, when storms announced themselves in Philadelphia by climbing chimneys and scolding rooftops. Etta ironed 2 shirts at midnight because heat can be turned to order, and order is the way stubborn women make the world answer for itself. The house breathed and kept the lamp low. Tom's horse shifted, leather creaking a sound like an old psalm. Cottonwood leaves gave an answer so small you would need to have lost a winter to hear it. Somewhere not far, a coyote told a joke to the moon and laughed at it alone. Lila dreamed brief and practical lists on a blackboard, a little boy whose ears were too small for his head sounding out the word river, a bell rope that kept slipping the knot until she swallowed her pride and asked Etta to show her the kitchen way to bind a thing to its job. She woke once to take a breath that might have been a sob if it had had a companion, then fell back into the kind of sleep that builds, not steals. Elias sat the first watch in the chair by the door, knees long, hat hung on the nearest peg as if even felt needed rest. He sipped coffee that had gone the exact temperature of regret and refused to confess it. He made his rounds every hour, touching latch and hinge as one checks old scars absent-mindedly and with respect. He stood a while by Knight's stall and let the horses slow chewing quiet the part of him that thought bravery was always the correct answer. Just before dawn, when everything in the world thinks about choosing a color, a sound came like a decision. Not the crack of a big thing breaking, but the little respectful cough a hinge makes when a door is trying not to be a secret. Elias was already moving when it happened, feet finding the floorboards he trusted to keep quiet. He signaled Jake without words. The ranch hand melted toward the back like a man who had been taught that being seen is sometimes the mistake you don't get to make twice. Tom raised a palm from the cottonwoods, shape of him cut clean against a thin slice of morning, and the deputy's shadow shifted to cover the lane. The rest of the day, and the next, would carry their own bright, hard truths. But the thing that mattered most had already occurred. The two of them had laid their history on the table like card and coin, and found that neither needed to hide their hands. The West is merciless with liars, and generous with people who admit their debts. They did not speak of marriage or forever. They spoke of the school bell Tom had scavenged from a church that moved downriver, of how many slates to order, of the precise height a desk should be, so a child will feel the sweet drag of pencil on wood and not the sting in the wrist. They argued kindly about whether readers should start with fables or with the Declaration, Elias voting for wolves and clever girls, Lila for sentences that announced citizens. They spoke of a fence line that wanted new posts and calves that did not care what men argued about. Between every ordinary word lay the unordinary fact that the East had let Lila go and the West had, for once, answered with kindness. There was an hour late in the afternoon when Etta insisted Lila learn the Ledger's grocery cipher, how flour turns into biscuits with a notch, and coffee turns into hospitality with an asterisk. Men do sums in coin, Etta said, tapping the pencil. Women do sums in meals. Lila added the asterisk, smiled as if inducted into a secret society of aprons and unsung victories. At dusk, a cool slip of wind passed through the house carrying the smell of water caught in cottonwood bark. Elias leaned in the doorway and watched Lila at the table, elbows planted, pencil moving with a steadiness that made him think of rivers that know their beds. "You'll have enemies, you know," he said gently. "Books do that to a place that likes not knowing its measurements." "I have enemies already," she replied, not looking up. "Ignorance, habit, fear that wears a pleasant face. If they're going to call on me, I may as well set extra plates." He smiled at that and felt it all the way to the painful part of his chest, where smiles had not been frequent guests. He stepped outside and let the dark find him, and in the quiet, after Etta's washing up clatter dwindled, he said a thing he did not often do. He thanked the land, not for sparing them, for testing them just enough that the word we had begun to learn its own strength. When she slept that night, she dreamed of rivers labeled correctly and roads that didn't lie. When he slept, he did not dream, which was its own miracle. Morning would bring a reckoning none of the arithmetic in her ledgers could balance, but if courage is an account, they'd made their first deposit. And out beyond the cottonwoods, the day took its breath and decided, for once, to start with mercy. They came when the world was still deciding whether to admit it was morning blue hour, the color of old bruises that haven't learned their lesson. The sky at the edges was thin milk. The cottonwoods held their breath so well that even the leaves forgot which side was meant to shine. 4 shadows unstitched themselves from the south fence line, 2 more from the east, and a 7th where a man had no business walking if he intended to keep his skin. Coyotes, somewhere beyond what the ear could name, went quiet the way gamblers quit tapping a table when the dealer's hands start moving too fast. The far spark at the henhouse straw flattered itself into flame and tried to be important. It licked upward in little yellow tongues like somebody's rude child. Elias didn't look at it. Fire, like pride, is often a decoy when the real business slips through a side door. "Not that direction," he said quietly to Jake, who was already moving with the quickness of a man who'd had a stern teacher and a tight childhood. "They want us thin." Tom, at his shoulder, murmured, "I was about to say a clever version of that," and took the right corner with a deputy who could shoot straight, even sleepy, hat brim pulled low, as if courtesy to Dawn mattered. The first bullet chewed the door jamb near Elias's shoulder and made a sound like someone dropping a nail in a hymn. The wood spit splinters with the tidy indignation of a churchwoman. He answered without ceremony, breathe, see, squeeze a leftover rhythm from a war that refused to remain politely in the past. Men who live with memory learn to keep time with it. A man pitched behind the stock tank, his hat rolling away like a decision reconsidered, and lay there counting the cost of breath. 2 more tried the kitchen window and met Etta Mae's doctrine delivered in lead. The lace curtain moved like a sigh. "I have outlived 2 husbands and 1 tornado," she advised the pre-dawn air, voice low enough to keep the coffee pot from boiling over. "You are not the 3rd thing to take my roof." The air considered this and chose to agree. A glass spindle shattered off the hutch and tumbled to the floor like a bell that wanted to be a warning. Etta cocked an eyebrow as if to say, "Now, who's washing that?" Then racked another shell with domestic precision. At the stair landing, Lila stood the way he'd shown her, feet planted as if she meant to teach the house a lesson about foundations. The floor under her boots had learned to trust its own nails, but it listened anyway when she spread her weight to quiet the boards. She took the breath that keeps a hand from shaking and turned it into a steadying count-in. Count out the way a teacher lets a room become hers before speaking. The man on the back stairs saw a schoolteacher and made the mistake men make when they think labels are armor. He rushed the last 3 steps like a boy late to mischief. Her shot took him in the shoulder. The railing took the rest of his courage. He left a trail of cursing that would not help him with any judge Tom knew. Elias moved sideways across the parlor, not fast, just correct, the way a river adjusts around a boulder without bragging about it. He had that quiet in him which gets louder when it's needed, the kind that instructs a room by refusing to be instructed by panic. From the porch, Jake called, "2 more east, cutting low," and the deputy, young enough to still believe in instructions, murmured, "Yes, sir," to a man who didn't need sirs, and squeezed off a shot that took the straw hat off a fool who had bet the house against common sense. Beckett came in with the last of the dark, scything across the dining room like someone who believes thresholds were built to flatter him. He was taller than rumor, handsomer too, which is a kind of ugliness that tricks people into courtesy it has not earned. His boots made the floorboards tell truths they didn't want to, where the knots were, which planks complained under weight, how many steps to the table, the clock, the doorway where a man like Elias would stand. "Hart," he called, honey stripped to brass. "Business." "Your business ran out when you lit what wasn't yours," Elias said, and the old private thing inside him, not here, stood up taller, took off its coat, and rolled its sleeves. Beckett moved, trained and quick, low as a man who'd learned to live by not being where bullets expected him. His first shot went wild, a bark that scared nothing but the clock. His second bit the banister below Lila's feet and threw splinters like bees. She flinched, then remembered everything Elias had taught her and the desert had stamped. People who take your steadiness want more than your balance. She refound her breath where she had left it between the ribs, behind resolve. Elias stepped into the open because there are sums. A man does not work on paper. His bullet found Beckett's thigh, the big muscle that turns a stride into collapse. Beckett staggered, smiled the way men do who think the universe owes them one more trick, and raised his gun toward the landing with a grace that belonged to practice. The sound that followed had braid in it. Elias's third shot and Lila's second spoke together a single word said in 2 mouths. Beckett folded with a look of personal offense, as if shot were a social slight. His weapon skittered under the table like a snake that hadn't read the ending and didn't care for literature. Silence doesn't return after a thing like that. It has to be rebuilt. It comes back plank by plank, nail by nail, in the small noises houses make when they decide to keep standing. Outside, Tom's voice traveled the yard in words that remembered their manners. Hold. Clear. Check. The syllables landed where they were placed and did the jobs they were told. A deputy cursed with relief, which is the only kind that counts, and laughed immediately after like a man who had found his breath still on the shelf he'd left it. Jake yelled, "All right," twice, once for himself and once for whoever needed it. The dawn came in at the window like a witness not eager to testify. Chickens, braver than they had any right to be, made opinionated sounds from the far side of the yard, offended that straw had been turned into a spectacle without filing a request with the proper hen. Inside, Etta reloaded with dainty hands, and then set the kettle on because decency demands coffee, even when decency has been busy. She wiped a splash of lamp soot off the stovepipe collar with a corner of her apron, as if to tidy the day's face before it saw itself. "I told you that doorframe was a fool's position, and I will not be widowing this house for a 3rd time by your inattention, do you hear me?" she said, closing a neat stitch over the nick on Elias's forearm that he hadn't felt. "You stand where you can see what's worth seeing, and be seen only by what deserves you." "Yes, ma'am," Elias said, easy as a man agreeing to gravity. Lila stood very still, the pistol lowering in increments, until it was a weight again. Not a word. She became aware of her hands, the way a singer becomes aware of her throat after the song, how it still remembers the shape of sound. Her fingers had begun to make their own small tremor, argument between body and will. Etta set the cup in her hands without asking. "Drink," she said. "Sugar helps the shakes remember who's in charge." "Oh." Tom stepped through the doorway with his hat in his hand, a reflex he would call respect for the dead later, when words were arranged for the deputy's report and a judge's ears. He looked at Beckett briefly, then away, as if to avoid the vanity of a last glance. There is an indecency in being the final set of eyes a man receives when he has misused the gift. "It's done," Tom said. The rest of them decided they liked living more than following orders. "Scouts are running them down." His eyes went to Lila, and then to the bullet, scored banister, and he nodded once as if a ledger had balanced. "You all right?" he asked, not demanding honesty, but making room for it. "My hands are arguing with me," she said, and only then did they begin to shake in earnest, as if named, they felt free to speak. He gave her the kind of smile men save for when their daughters do something brave that costs them sleep. "They'll come to an understanding," he said. "Hands are reasonable when consulted." By midday, the yard had changed back to a place where bread could rise and horses could decide not to kick. The soldiers Tom had borrowed from nobody carried out the worst of the morning's choices under canvas, quiet, competent, uncurious. They talked little and wrote less, and when they lifted what was left of men who had made wrong promises to their mothers, they did it with a care that looked like prayer without needing church language. The deputies took statements as if words might stitch the world into a shape the judge could sign: short cloth, straight seams, none of that fancy embroidery gossip favors. The Henhouse straw affair, as it would be called by the three old men who played checkers in front of the general store, who had not been there and therefore knew everything, cost the ranch a few windows, one railing, and a piece none of them had trusted anyway. Etta swept glass into a tidy pan as if daring it to think about becoming a metaphor. "You will not. You will be trash and like it," she told the shards, and the broom obeyed with vigor. Jake, who had a knack for fixing what other men would replace, set about salvaging trim from the ruined kitchen window, tongue between teeth in concentration. Harmon found the hat the doorjamb had eaten and set it on the porch rail, crown-down frontier for half-mast. The deputy with steady hands used a pencil as if it were a scalpel, sketching the room quick and neat for the report. Lines where bullets bit, X's where men had stood, notes that said things like, "Teacher woman defended stair W divided by notable calm," which would make Tom smile later and say, "Promote that pen." They ate late, plates balanced in lamplight at the kitchen table, because the dining room felt set aside for the departed. The coffee was wrong for comfort and perfect for staying awake. Etta took her plate to the porch, claiming the air tasted better, which was her way of letting two people be alone without prying, and while still listening for trouble through the thin wood of weathered boards. The house gave back its small, faithful noises: tick, settle, the soft negotiation of timber and nail, the kind murmurs of a structure deciding to continue. When words finally returned, Elias pushed his plate away and told the truth the way a man who has no gift for speeches tells it, plain, unornamented, offered like water. "I can't promise you a life without men like him," he said, and the admission felt like a kind of reverence, an altar at which he set down pride. "But I can promise you a gate that locks and a man who checks it twice." "Lo." Lila looked at the window where the night was arranging itself, for morning thin paleness peeking where blue had been heavy, and found the shape of an answer she did not know how to polish. "I can promise children who read their names out loud," she said, "and a door that opens when good people knock." They met hands across the table halfway, exactly like a treaty both sides had already begun to honor. It wasn't a clasp so much as a laying down of arms. Outside, the cottonwoods rehearsed forgiveness, practicing their leaf speech until it sounded like a kind of rain. Inside, Etta cleared her throat just once to remind the house it was still standing, then muttered something about pie crust, as if the world could be braved with flour and shortening. The day lengthened in its honest way. Deputies returned with prisoners who had learned the range looks larger when you're being chased. Men were sat on the porch steps where a person could think about outcomes while spying the horizon. Tom walked the yard and chose a lean patch of shade to do his paperwork, because putting the law's ink on the same ground where sin had strutted pleases a certain frontier logic. He sent the steady-handed deputy into town with the first bundle of affidavits and a note to the judge phrased plain: primary threat neutralized by lawful defense, Property damage minimal. Witnesses numerous. Proceed. The boy from the telegraph office arrived with his hat on backward, breath running ahead of him like a dog off leash. He handed Tom a folded message from the county seat scouts, confirmed 2 of Beckett's men were already in cuffs, outside a livery that had seen better manners. The army wanted statements. The judge wanted clarity. The newspaper wanted adjectives. Tom gave the first 2 and starved a third. Elias walked the fence line, not because it needed him, but because his hands did. He found the place where a bullet had shaved a sliver off the corner post neat, almost thoughtful, as if asking permission to ruin the day. He rubbed the scar smooth with his thumb, as if making the wood forget. Night paced him along the wire, snorting when a grasshopper sprang up with more enthusiasm than talent. Lila swept the stair careful, steady, collecting the splinters as if they were a lesson's final, unavoidable points. When she reached the landing, she touched the new gouge with the pad of one finger and felt the house's memory under her skin. She did not cry, not because tears weren't owed, but because sometimes a woman pays in order first, and lets sorrow come afterward when supper is cleared and the lamp turned down to a polite gold. Near the washstand, she set the colt on a folded towel and cleaned it with a concentration that made the small task feel like worship without idolatry. Cloth through barrel, oil where needed, a patient check of screws that had worked loose from loud learning. Respect, she whispered, almost smiling at the echo of earlier lessons, not worship. When she seated the cylinder, the click sounded like the end of a sentence that had taken all morning to write. Toward mid-afternoon, 3 neighbors reined in at the gate the way good men come, with announcements already on their faces. Clayton Carter had sent them in person to say what the messenger had said the night before. Neighbors stand together. Men could be spared from the double C to sit a watch, mend a fence, repair what was scorched. Elias thanked them with a handclasp, and that half-smile that made other men match his decency. They drank water with their hats off, and rode away lighter, as if courtesy were a load shared. Inside, Etta boiled the kettle again and announced with tyrant's affection that everyone would be having tea to convince your nerves you aren't as important as you think. She set out a plate of sugar cookies that she pretended had not, in fact, been kept for a celebration that had not yet found its excuse. Lila took one, bit, and discovered that sweetness can be a revelation earned by daylight's ugliness. Eat another, Etta said. Doctors can't put courage back the way sugar can. Is that science? Tom asked from the doorway, admirable in his restraint not to take 2. It's kitchen, Etta said. Which is the older of the 2? By late afternoon the soldiers were gone with their quiet card of consequence. The yard looked like itself again, only more so every board known by name, every hinge newly grateful to be a hinge. The rooster, who had suffered indignities beyond telling, strutted in a circle that implied a speech later. The children who had watched with large eyes from the cottonwood shadows earlier were sent home by Etta with bread ends and strict instructions on silence. Evening pulled its cool shirt over the range. Elias and Lila stepped out to the porch and let the last of the sun write them in copper. Tom sat 1 more hour by the gate, then rose with aches that belonged to both duty and age. I'll leave a deputy here 2 nights, he said, and ride the long circle besides. But I don't think mischief will try the same house twice with such poor success. Fools recycle themselves, Etta observed from behind her teacup, but even a fool knows a closed door when it breaks his nose. Tom tipped his hat, a thank you for hospitality and a pardon from more advice. You'll have quiet, he told Lila. Newspapers will bluster. Men at the saloon will practice being near danger with their mouths. Pay them no mind. He looked to Elias. We'll hold court next week. You come in only when called. I know the story. I watched it told. After he rode off, quiet arrived, not as a lack, but as presence, the way a well-made quilt holds weight without smothering. Lila leaned against the post and felt the grain under her shoulder, the faint ribs where paint had been scraped and repainted by hands that knew how to make a thing last. Elias stood beside her, near enough that their sleeves understood each other. You all right? He asked, the question small because small is how large concerns pass through the throat. I am persuaded toward it, she said, and surprised herself with the honesty. Good, he said. The land takes kindly to persuasion that doesn't lie. They watched bats begin their black-letter handwriting across the last pale sky, stitching up the day with a grammar older than law. A whippoorwill started up beyond the corral, and somewhere to the south, a coyote offered editorial comment and was ignored. When the lamp called them back inside, Etta had already turned down the corners of the day, dishes stacked, table wiped, the kettle set off to the cool of the stove's far side. "Sleep," she ordered, as if handing out bandages. "Tomorrow expects you." They didn't sleep immediately. There are nights when a body must rehearse being still before stillness agrees. Lila lay listening to her own breath like a student to a new language, slow repetition until meaning arrives. The left hand, traitorous earlier, lay quiet on the coverlet, as if having spoken its complaint, it now consented to peace. Elias, on the far side of a thin wall in a world of decency, sat in the parlor chair and let the last of the coffee go cold while he counted hinges under his breath. Front door, pantry, back hall, upstairs, landing like rosary for men who love wood more than beads. He told himself, there in the near dark, a truth he had been practicing all day. Strength is not only the shot you take in the right second, it is the hours after when you choose to be gentle on purpose. Morning would tilt toward chores and statements and neighbors who arrived with pie, as if pastry could do the work of parable. The school bell Lila loved with awkward affection would need a new rope, and the banister a craftsman's honest hand. The children would come tomorrow or the next, blinking at the world's news, as if it had been a blackboard lesson they half heard. And, because the West is a maker of continuations, calves would still be born with no regard for headlines. Beans would climb, and cottonwoods would lift the day like ushers' arms. For now, the house kept them. For now, the door latched with the mild, triumphant click of a small promise kept. For now, silence held, not empty, but earned. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The school bell had come from a church that moved downriver and left its music behind. Someone had pried it from a steeple that no longer had a congregation to keep it honest, put it on a mule, and walked it upriver because sound doesn't like to go to waste. The bronze had a hairline scar you could feel with your thumb, a history the eye might miss, and when Lila tested it 2 days earlier, the note rang true if a little shy, as if it needed reminding that its business was hope. On the first morning, it sounded like a second chance, hammered thin and bright. The valley listened. The cottonwoods along the creek gave a light shiver. A pair of meadowlarks interrupted their own song to see what sort of human enterprise warranted such ringing. 23 children lined up in boots that pinched and bare feet that didn't, hands folded out of habit or because they didn't yet know what to do with them. Their faces had the seriousness of people encountering furniture that suggests rules, desks, straight-back chairs, a slate on each top that smelled faintly of riverstone. A little boy named August came in backward because he'd heard that was how you leave a place, and he wanted to be sure departure stayed friendly. A girl called Ruthie held her little brother's hand, as if keeping him from floating. Lila wrote her name on the board, and then, one by one, theirs, as if letters could anchor a person to a world where sound becomes meaning. Her handwriting had the grace of Philadelphia and the firmness of Arizona. When she paused between names, she listened for syllables that wanted to hide, coaxed them forward, and smiled when they came. She taught numbers like promises you can keep with practice. 2 and 2, she told them, is something you can hold in both hands and not drop. She taught maps like forgiveness. Here you are. Here is where you might go. There is a wide space between, and we will learn to cross it. With chalk, she drew a river that tried to change its mind around a boulder and a road that respected the river's right to disagree. By mid-morning, the room held heat and attention in equal measure. There are ways to keep 23 small bodies pointed toward the same good. Praise given carefully, mischief granted a polite aisle to march out, a story kept in reserve about a woman who measured the stars with a kettle lid because she did not own a sextant. The children let their mouths fall open at that, as if the sky had just lowered itself to handshake distance. A boy named Teddy whispered to Jonah, "We have lids," and Jonah whispered back, "But first we need sky." Lila pretended not to hear, while allowing the conversation to change their posture from defense to curiosity. At noon, Elias arrived with a crate he insisted had always belonged to the schoolhouse slates, chalk, a little tin of wrapped sweets. No one saw him leave on the shelf. He fixed the sticky window because he needed a nail and a hinge to obey someone in this county. He stood in the doorway and watched her gather a wild room into focus, with nothing but a piece of chalk and a voice that knew how to make command sound like invitation. He had never loved order until he'd watched it enlarged into kindness by the right hand. Tom came by pretending to check a latch and stayed long enough for a child to ask if he could read, which made him leave quickly in case he cried. In the yard afterward, he blamed the wind for the look in his eyes and promised himself to learn the second half of the alphabet his wife hadn't lived long enough to finish teaching him. The valley changed its gait without announcing it. Men who had spent years talking only of weather began to report on their children's spelling with the same solemn pride. They discovered you could brag in 3 letters as easily as in 300 head of cattle. The blacksmith started chalking multiplication tables on his back wall and fined himself a penny for every mistake. Women traded recipes for soup that stretched weeks and stories that stretched courage. Etta started a lending shelf in the corner of the kitchen that grew into something that made the house heavier and happier, a row of readers, a Bible with worn tabs, a travelogue that lied colorfully about Paris, Emerson that Elias pretended not to reread. When folks returned books, Etta asked what they liked about them, and if the answer was, "the end," she made them try again. Nights cooled, mornings sharpened. The porch lamp burned later than frugal, but exactly as long as hope requires. Elias didn't ask a formal question, not with ring or flowers, but he began to live as if he'd asked one and been told yes. A second cup on the nail by the pump, a drawer cleared, as if he'd made room in his days, and was waiting for her to put herself there. Lila answered in the grammar she understood. She stayed when the wind went mean. She put her boots next to his under the bed and called that order home. She wrote lesson plans in the evenings while he mended tack. And once, when her pencil broke, he handed his knife across the table without looking, as if attendance to one another's small needs were the only vow worth speaking aloud. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of the last West Town. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Autumn arrived like a polite guest who brought more food than he would eat. The Cottonwoods turned coins and let them go. Lila organized a harvest exhibition in the schoolyard. Jars of beans with labels in careful hands, a pumpkin carved into a map of the valley, 3 sketches of horses that looked like horses had agreed to stand inside paper. Parents came suspicious and left generous. A man who had not smiled since his brother left for California found himself explaining a fraction to his daughter and discovering joy had not become extinct. Winter bullied the range into silver. Fences sang when the wind leaned on them, long notes that carried gossip to the hills. The stove learned a steady song, and the house has always been grateful for music. Lila taught by lamplight, her breath a small cloud in the doorway when she went out to ring the bell, and some days she rang it twice because faith sometimes needs echo. There were days when grief arrived uninvited and sat down like weather. Elias would take the peppermint tin from the high shelf, set it on the table, and just look. Lila would put a hand near the photograph and say nothing at all. There were days when laughter made the rafters answer. Etta teaching spelling with pi, I before E except when I say so. Tom losing a checker game to a boy who counted kings better than the sheriff counted cattle. A cold snap stitched itself across 3 weeks. The creek put on a thin lid and pretended to be a mirror. Horses blew steam that made them look like locomotives thinking slowly. One morning a little girl named Ada came to school with her baby brother tucked into her shawl. Lila rearranged lessons so reading and rocking could happen in the same minute. The boys who had scorned dolls learned the mathematics of soothing. Count to 100 while patting softly, she told them, and they learned that patience is a series as useful as any sum. Elias hauled wood, then hauled more, and when wood ran low, he read aloud to the room while his hands waited for thaw. He pronounced Emerson stubborn, as if meeting an adversary worth keeping. He read a paragraph about self-reliance that made Etta snort and say, "Fine, but who's making biscuits?" He closed the book and made biscuits. Tom brought newspapers flattened under his saddle and practiced sounding out headlines at the kitchen table. "TT tariff," he would growl, then grin when the syllables clicked. Man ought to be able to read the law that binds him. Snow left in whispers, not apologies. Spring returned with its ordinary miracle. Water made loud, calves convinced the world had been designed for running, cottonwoods greening with a sound you only hear when you've buried a winter and it stayed down. The schoolhouse windows came open on a morning that smelled like repair. Lila moved desk to desk with a damp cloth, telling each with a touch, "You've done well." Children, like furniture, improve when wiped with attention. She hung a new map, this one honest, about the river's curve, and a drawing of an apple sliced to show the star where seeds live. On the far fence, Elias measured out a new line of posts and said, half to himself and half to the sky, apples might do there. He could see it, a run of saplings stubborn against wind, a future that looked like shade and pies, and the miracle of sweetness arrived by patience. Lila answered, "They might," and surprised herself with how much the sentence felt like permission. She pictured children climbing, fruit-heavy in September, warm, a lesson in seasons that did not need chalk. They didn't speak of forever, because forever lives where people have the leisure to pretend time is an inheritance. They spoke of Saturday's list, of a shelf he would plane level, of a hymn Etta wanted returned to the house, the old one with honest verbs, of Tom's plan to teach 3 boys that a badge is only as dignified as the man it rests on. They saddled in the gold hour and rode the ridge until the sky remembered it could be a painting silver blue poured thin at the horizon, the land throwing itself wide open and saying yes in a language with no vowels. Elias pointed out fence breaks in places where the ground remembered buffalo. Lila pointed out colors he had mistaken for mere light. Between them a lexicon formed. Post, he would say. Mercy, she would answer. Horizon, they would agree. School, like ranching, found its cadence. Monday brought grammar because beginnings favor rules. Tuesday figures, Wednesday maps, Thursday story. Friday all the small mercies copy work, sweeping, a half hour for singing. They held a spelling bee under cottonwoods that made every word look sacred. Ruthie spelled path like prayer. August tried to fit too many G's into the word beginning and laughed himself out of competition. The community put hands together without making a fuss, and afterward Lila served lemonade that tasted like a promise kept. There were tests that weren't on paper. A fever laid 4 houses low. The school became a kitchen of quiet soup, a depot for blankets, a place where older children read to younger while mothers slept sitting up. Etta ran the room like a general, directing pots and prayers. "Don't ask permission to be kind," she told a boy at the door. "Ask what needs carrying." He carried the wood and later his pride like newly earned weight. A prairie fire tested the valley's edge, running low and mean, whipped by a wind nobody had hired. Tom rode its black lip with 5 men, beating and backfiring. Elias took the creek side with buckets and bad words. Children were kept home with damp sacks on rooftops. In the smoke-laced dawn after, the school reopened and Lila had them copy the word resilience until even the ones who didn't understand it felt braced by its shape. There were letters, too, that came and went. One arrived from Philadelphia, addressed in a hand Lila recognized and did not fear anymore. A former pupil, grown now into a woman with wages of her own, wrote that she had married a printer, ink and all, and enclosed a paper clipping about women organizing a reading room. Lila read it to the class and held the thin page up like a lantern. "Books," she told them, "are the only furniture you can move into any house and make it your own." She sent back a pressed cottonwood leaf and a story about a girl named Ada who learned to count to 100 with one hand while rocking a baby with the other. By late spring, Etta's lending shelf annexed the far wall. People brought what they had and borrowed what they needed. Tom left his primer one evening with half the pages dog-eared, like a man intentionally reminding himself where to breathe. "I aim to read the law without asking it to slow down," he said, and Lila nodded as if deputizing him to pursue his own literacy. There was a day the river misbehaved, fat with melt and impatient with banks. The youngest children watched bits of last year's world float by sticks they'd used as horses, a tin cup with no handle, once even a hat. Lila drew the river on the board again and labeled it change. "You can't stop it," she said, "but you can learn to cross it and, on a good day, borrow its power." August raised his hand and asked if borrowing without permission counted as theft. "Only if you forget to say thank you," she answered, and the room nodded as if law had been usefully amended. Through it all, Elias kept to his circles: fence, herd, store, home, and the schoolhouse that had somehow become part of his route without announcement. He replaced the banister that had taken Beckett's temper, planed the new rail until it felt like a sentence completed properly. He planted the apple sticks in a neat row and read an almanac as if it were a melodrama. Late frost for the villain, bees for the cavalry, patient hands for the heroine. He learned the art of sharpening children's slate pencils with enough angle to make a good line and not enough to break on first use. "There's a geometry to kindness," he told Lila one night. Acute, not obtuse. She kissed the back of his hand for the joke and the truth under it. A summer pageant tried itself in June, a festival so modest it would have blushed to hear the word. Still, a sheet was hung for a curtain. Jonah read lines from a borrowed Shakespeare in a voice that would one day sell tickets, and Ruthie sang a hymn so ancient the cottonwoods stood still. Tom wore a clean shirt and polished his badge until it could see itself, and sat in the back row with his hat on his knees, the way fathers do when they have forgotten where to put their hands. Etta cried once and blamed onions, though none were near. The porch lamp kept learning the discipline of late. Some nights, Lila graded copybooks until the moths wrote their own margins. Some nights, she and Elias spoke sparse and worthwhile, trading field notes about human nature, as if mapping a country neither had been taught in school. "Boys are loud when they're frightened," she said. "So are men," he admitted. "Girls disappear when they think they are trouble," she said. "So do men," he said again, and they both laughed quietly at the symmetry. When storms built in the south, Elias watched their anvil tops with the wary affection one reserves for relatives who might bring gifts or grievance. Lila taught thunder to the youngest as a vocabulary. That was a far one, that was a near. Count between light and sound and see if the world is walking closer. Ruthie started counting love between lightning and clap and decided that love was steady because it always arrived. No one argued. And then, because the West insists, there were the small catastrophes that prove a place friendly by how folks answer. Jonah fell from a hayloft and refused to cry. Lila fastened a splint and taught the class to sign words so he could brag with hands while his mouth rested. A cow had twins and confusion about maternity. Elias sorted the problem with patience and a bucket, and the children learned biology without blushes. A woman went into labor 2 weeks early. Etta's kitchen turned hospital. Tom found himself holding a white-hot hand and reciting the alphabet he had newly tamed because letters, it turned out, could coach a man through any pain if said with proper reverence. Summer tilted into its long honey hours. Dust became a seasoning on everything. The school closed for 4 weeks, so small fingers could harvest beans and big ones could mend roofs. Learning shifted where it liked to live in those months: fields, porches, creek banks, the shady corner of a corral. Lila took notes on how boys memorize star patterns faster than Latin, how girls remember the price of nails better than adults, how everyone, when given an apple and a story, chooses to save the last bite for the last sentence. Elias built a shade lean-to by the well, a place where midday could come gentle. He sometimes found Lila there at the edge of afternoon, skirts tucked, hair loosened by heat, pencil moving. He stood quiet in the doorway of shade and counted the seconds before she noticed him, as if to practice gratitude. Once, when she looked up with that small catch of breath that means joy, he said, "We're doing it." She asked, "Doing what?" And he said, "Belonging." They didn't speak of forever, because the word had the bad habit of making promises other words had to keep. Instead, they honored things they could do with their hands: fix, carry, teach, plant, read, forgive. There were days they argued about nothing: the best time to water, whether students should copy with tongues out. Elias, "Not if they bite them." Lila, "Tongues are part of thinking, and days when they agreed so strongly it scared them, like the morning she said, "If the apples take, the valley will have something sweet that didn't need to be stolen." And he said, "Yes," so soft, the word hardly made sound, and yet it rang. They saddled in the gold hour and rode the ridge until the sky remembered it could be a painting. Silver blue poured thin at the horizon, the land throwing itself wide open and saying yes in a language with no vowels. The herd scattered like punctuation across a sentence only the range could read. Etta's lamp, to the east, became a grammar of home. Comma when it rocked, semicolon when she trimmed it, period when she turned it down and asked the house to mind itself. Tom's campfire on a distant knoll,